Hey everyone, this is Tin, and I will be doing a motion debrief video on the motion that this House would make the number of votes an individual has in elections inversely proportional to their expected remaining lifespan. In other words, young people receive more votes. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk very briefly through the prop and the op case for this motion. What are the general problems that each side tries to tackle? What are the ways in which either side can try to preempt or co-opt the other side's arguments in order to win the debate? Starting with the proposition, the first thing we always need to do is we need to check the verb in the motion. So the verb in the motion is would. It's a this House would motion, meaning that the government has fiat to implement a model within the round. In this particular round, a model does not need to be particularly complex. You just need to have a general reasonable idea. I think probably what most governments would say is they would say we would have a tiered system where we would divide the population into different age cohorts and we would rank the number of votes they have based on which age group they belong to. So for example, pensioners still get 1 vote, people from 40 to 60 get 2 votes, people from 20 to 40 get 3. Whatever works, as long as it's within the boundaries of reason, any kind of tiered system will work. This is not a model heavy debate. It's rather an argument heavy debate. The reason why I mentioned a model is just to emphasize, to keep in mind the idea that when you're analyzing the motion prep, when you're starting to do prep, the first thing you need to do is look at the verb in the motion and see what are the burdens which this particular verb requires of you and the other things in the round, and adjust prep accordingly. So let's see what the prop can say in this round. So starting off intuitively, it seems as if the prop requires you to defend some kind of inequality, because in the status quo, everyone has the same amount of votes, and now you are proposing to give a particular group a large amount of votes. So it seems to suggest that you need to defend something which perhaps on the get-go seems unfair. So let's see how we can turn this around. Let's see if we can actually claim on a proposition that we are fighting for more equality and not more inequality. And I think the analysis to back this up would be just a general theoretical position which claims that equality within a country, democracy or otherwise, is not just counted in the number of votes. Votes are a tool to achieve equality, but they're only one of the tools. Equality means that everyone within society has roughly equal access to opportunities and roughly equal access to a dignified life. If currently a certain group of people has more access to a dignified life than another, and both groups have the same votes, this system is in fact unfair rather than fair. So the way for proposition to actually turn this on its head and claim that they're fighting for equality, we need to explain why young people are actually systematically disprivileged within the current status quo. So let's try to think about what are the reasons why older individuals perhaps have more privilege than younger individuals. I think the first thing is, given that they are older, they're probably able to amass a larger amount of capital over time. This means they've had a career, they have certain savings, they have certain, probably they own property, they probably own a house or a flat, especially because in earlier times, like in 3 or 4 decades ago, it was far easier to get a house or a flat because housing prices and rent prices and stuff like this was lower. All of these things, which means they have some kind of cushion to fall back on. Most young people do not, because they have only just entered the job market. A lot of them are still within the educational system. They have to juggle things like student loans. A lot of them do not own property, and a lot of them do not have savings, which means that in terms of an access to, a dignified life and like generally life security, young people probably have it worse than a lot of older individuals. This also probably spills over into politics, insofar as older individuals probably then have more time and more space to devote themselves to politics. Secondly, I think it's just connections. Over time, you accumulate a lot of connections. You accumulate a lot of people who can help you when you find yourself in a tough situation. Older individuals, having had more different connections and having built more relationships over a longer time, probably have more of those. Thirdly, just demographically, it's true that people who sit in parliament and who sit in CEO boards of companies are older more often than they are younger, which means that they occupy the positions of power in society more often than younger people do. What this means is that they already have the upper hand in terms of the amount of power they control in society, which is one of the things we seek to rectify through voting mechanisms. And secondly, they have more of an access to opportunities and to privilege. And this means that by turning around the amount of votes and giving younger people more votes, we are equalizing the playing field, i.e., given that the group has already amassed a certain amount of societal and political power outside of the realm of voting, we need to equalize this by granting more power to the other group within the realm of voting, and therefore we give them more power to control the state and to control its policies. There are 2 ways in which we can draw conclusions from this. The first is a principled one, which is to say, you can always do the basic state power principle. The state power principle largely goes as follows. It says that there is a disproportionate amount of power that the state has over every one of its citizens. First of all, because the state determines every single facet of your life through its policy, be it through welfare, education, healthcare, or whatever else. Secondly, because the state has an immense amount of coercive power it can utilize against its citizens. So the state has the court system, it has the police, it has the military, which it can use to force its citizens to comply should they not wish to comply with the state. And it's absolutely impossible to resist this as an individual citizen. Thirdly, it's practically impossible to be stateless. So you can move within states, but insofar as the world is made up of sovereign states, you can never escape the yoke of the state. And this means that your life is always fundamentally inescapably determined by the state. In order for you to be therefore able to control your own life and therefore pursue your own definition of dignity, your own definition of happiness, you need to be able to control the state because the state ultimately controls you. The reason why this principle justification is important is because in this motion you can then claim, in order for younger individuals, because we have already established that older people have more power, for younger individuals to be able to meaningfully control their lives, they need to have a larger amount of power over the state to equalize against the power the older people have. The importance of the principle justification here is this. You can make it independent of the practical. So even if, when we grant younger people more votes, they will not vote more, they will be apathetic, they will not go to the ballot box, or maybe they will even be a problem of collective responsibility where everyone is going to think, now in my age group has more votes, then we're going to have an upper hand anyway, so why should I go and vote? Even if all of this happens, we can still argue that principally, younger individuals deserve to have more votes because they are this privileged group in society and the state owes it to them to give them those votes. And even if they don't use them, it is still a principal obligation to provide them with these votes. And that's a sufficient enough reason to propose the motion. So this is an example where you can make a principal justification independent of practical arguments. But you can also make the practical, which is to say younger people are probably now going to vote more because they have pressing issues, as we've established. They have things like student loans, they have things like problems with accessing healthcare. A lot of them don't have health insurance. A lot of them have problems with accessing property, getting to live in their own place and stuff like this. They're going to have an incentive to vote. They're actually going to resolve the issues that are plaguing them. I think there's another principle justification that can be used here, which is independent of the first one. This is very important when doing prep in terms of that you want to have independent strands of reasoning which don't depend on one another, for the reason that even if one of them fails, and even if one of them gets rebutted or the judge doesn't buy it, you have another which is not contingent on the first one, which can still be your avenue to victory. You always want to have multiple avenues to victory if possible. I think the other principle justification is to say younger individuals are simply going to have more need of the state for a longer time. By the fact their lifespan is going to be longer, they're going to be here for 30 or 40 or 60 more years, they are going to have a need of the state's policies, of the state's welfare mechanisms, of the state safeguarding for a far longer time than older individuals will. And proportional, therefore, to the amount of services they're going to use to the state, they should have that proportional amount of control over the state, because the amount of control you have should be proportional to the amount of need you have. And you can make analogies to this. We already have these kinds of tiered systems elsewhere. We use progressive taxation, where we tax the rich more because we think that the rich are able to bear the brunt of being taxed better than those at the bottom. A similar logic is used here. We're going to give more votes to those at the bottom because we think that they are in larger need than elsewhere. And you can always use this analogy and similar analogies to push burdens on the other side. So you can say, okay, if you don't propose this policy, then do you also oppose things like progressive taxation or things like affirmative action? It's always useful to put other teams in positions where they have to argue against both the motion and your analogy, or explain why the analogy is not analogous. It's just a good strategic move to do all together. I think lastly, we can just talk about the practical impacts of this outside of the benefits for the young. I think we can just talk about the general characteristics of what are the young going to vote for. So what is going to be the general pattern that the youth is going to follow when voting. First of all, it is statistically true that the youth is more progressive than the older demographic cohorts. This is increasingly likely to happen insofar as the influence of social media, the amount of exposure to different experiences of different individuals makes people more empathetic and all of these things, and more younger people are being socialized into progressive circles. They are statistically more progressive than the older cohorts, which means that we are likely to get more progressive policies voted in. This means things like better policies for immigration and asylum seekers. This probably means like more liberal policies in terms of sexual and gender minorities' rights. This generally means more things like progressive taxation, all of these things. Of course, you cannot just immediately assume that progressive policies are good. This is a mistake that a lot of debaters make. You need to give general justifications. I think it is easy to justify in the sense of saying, look, this probably means that a wider variety of societal groups, specifically when we talk about the rights of the disprivileged and the minorities, are going to be taken into account. This is important because we think that every human being deserves equal rights to live safely within the state and deserves equal dignity. Progressive policies are the type of policy that tries to reach out to the disprivileged groups in society and provide them with that, and we think that's good. This seems to be intuitive, but it needs to be said in debating, because debaters very often just assume that progressivism is necessarily good. I think the second characteristic would be, given that younger people are likely to be here for a long time, they would probably have interest in proposing policy which is more long-termist and more sustainable over the long run. So this is probably going to be things like combating climate change, because they are going to be the ones who are going to face the consequences of it in 30 or 40 years with the rising sea levels and all of these things. This probably means they're trying to switch to renewable energy, because they're the ones who are going to be faced with oil shortages along the line, and not the older cohorts who don't have to think about that and all of these things. You can claim the benefits of sustainability coming from that. Lastly, and this is a step that every prep time needs to have, which is the question of preemptives. So what is the opposition going to say, and how do we counter that? I think what the opposition is probably going to say is going to be, okay, but what about, the needs of the older people? Like especially like the very old, they have needs of things like pensions and things like healthcare and all of these things. I think probably there's a very easy preemptive on Gov to say these things are not going to get cut and are not going to get sidelined for two reasons. First of all, it's bipartisan. So nobody wants to be, the one who hates on the old and the one who disprivileges the old and elderly and, the helpless. That just doesn't sound good and doesn't have good optics. But secondly, every young person has a grandma and every young person has a grandpa, which means like they have emotional connections to the older cohorts. They have a level of understanding of what the older cohorts need. They're incredibly unlikely to put their grandma in a position where she doesn't have a pension. Like this doesn't seem like something people would do. Probably like still all of the basic policies that the older individuals need are going to be catered for. Onto the opposition. You probably want to argue along the same lines as the government in terms of wanting to achieve as much equality within the system. And probably the best thing to do here is to accept the governmental logic of we want a system that is perfect, as not perfectly, but as equal and as fair as possible, and then try to flip the government arguments in their head, which would mean that probably the best strategy from off would be to argue that in fact, older individuals are in the largest amount of need and in more need of the state services as compared to younger people. First of all, the older you are, the more you need from the state. So if we're talking about pensioners, you depend on your state pension, or you depend on state healthcare and all of these things. You probably no longer have a career. You're unable to have a career. Even if you're not a pensioner, the older you get, the less profitable you are for employers to employ, because they want to take younger individuals who are more accustomed to contemporary trends of social communication, who are more accustomed to contemporary technology, who can be there for longer, so there are longer investment. Also, the older you get, the less likely you are to be able to retrain as the job market changes, which means that your career opportunities are smaller than those of younger individuals. Thirdly, you are more likely to require healthcare. So the older you get, just statistically, this is true. Older people can have more health problems, and this is not just when you are old. Just the older you get, when you get middle age, you're more likely to have health issues and to use healthcare more frequently than young people do, simply biologically. All of these things mean that, first of all, older people are in larger need than younger individuals, and they are more vulnerable than younger individuals, and this increases as time goes by. And you can make the proposition side seem very illogical. The older people get, they become more vulnerable and more needy, and the older they get, the less votes you give them. This seems to be actively contrary to the government principle. And by putting it this way, you can make the government seem very, very illogical. I think similarly to what you say in the government, you can make a principle justification, which is to say, even if the government is correct in saying that young people will not disprivilege their grandmothers and old people's issues or older people's issues are still going to be taken care of, you can see in the opposition that, first of all, it's still principally unfair from the part of the state, because the state would be the one proposing this policy, right? It's unfair from the position of the state to risk their lives in such a way and to put them in a position where they depend on the goodwill and on the gracefulness and the charity of the younger generations with no means to fight back should things go wrong, no means to control and help their own lives should things go wrong. So the state is putting them in a position of vulnerability where they have no recourse towards the state, and they count on whether the youth are going to treat them well. And even if in most cases they will, it's still unfair from the state to put them in such a risky position in the first place. I think a second argument that can be made here in terms of just preempting government is just to say, sure, maybe the young are not going to, cut pensions or whatever, but older individuals' issues are still going to be more sidelined. Because as the government themselves say, and you can co-opt their case, young people have very pressing issues to attend to, student loans and all of these things. So when you have a more equal system where everyone has equal votes, it means that all demographic groups are catered to relatively equally because they all matter similarly when it comes to winning elections. When younger individuals have more votes, it means that politicians are more likely to cater to the young. This is going to be the government mechanism. The government is going to say politicians are going to focus most of their policy or more of their policy on the young because the young now win elections. But this proportionately also means that they focus less of their time on the older individuals because they don't win elections. They won't campaign on reforming the pension system if it's necessary. They won't campaign on reforming care homes and access to care homes. But this is not going to win elections. So even if the young are not going to vote to disprivilege the old, there's probably a lot of services and a lot of utilities that need improvement within the state in terms of access for older individuals, which are now not going to get the care that they need. So even if it's not active disprivilege, you still sideline some issues that should not be sidelined and should be given the same attention as other issues. And this is most equally distributed if we have a system with equal votes. In terms of the other arguments that can be made, I think there could be an argument made about antagonism between age groups, i.e. in situations where the young get more votes. I think probably a lot of older individuals are going to feel that the younger are more privileged, that they are being favored by the state. It's probably going to make them very mad. I think this can create a gap of generational understanding, which can genuinely damage family relations, especially in situations where people disagree about things. And I think a good example to make this intuitive, and it's always good to have intuitive examples, is I think Trump. So there are a lot of stories about how the Trump versus Biden election, fractured families, because part of the family voted for Trump and part of the family voted for Biden. And these are such irreconcilable differences that people actually stop talking to each other and things like that. In situations where the young would have more votes, and then let's say the young voted more for Biden, and then you would have an additional amount of frustration because people who voted for Trump, for example, in this case, would think that this is incredibly unfair because the reason that they lost is because another group just got more votes than them and that their opinions were sidelined. I think this just creates an additional strain on people's family relations, and you can argue that's a bad thing. And I think just lastly, in terms of the idea when government claims, more progressive policies or more long-term policies, I think the thing that you can do is try to relativize this, which is to say there is no objectively correct or objectively good policy. We have absolutely no access to the truth, even if such a truth were to exist, what the objectively good policy is. The reason for that is that the definition of what is good or what is utile for different individuals differs from person to person. And given that people differ between each other, there is no one single agreed upon definition of utility or definition of good. Given that there is no answer as to what the objectively good policy is, and given that we also believe that every individual should have equal access and equal recourse to the state, which is co-opting the government's own logic, therefore, the only correct thing to do is to give every subjective definition of the good an equal say within society. If we do not, we are privileging a certain type of policy and privileging a certain type of preference without any actual backing for it. Because there's no reason why we would favor one type of policy over the other, or one group's preferences, subjective preferences over others. Given that we don't have these reasons, because we don't have access to objective truth, it is an unfair thing to do, which is how you can respond to a practical point with a principle response. I think the last thing to point out here is just to say that when talking about the young versus the old, of course, this is how I put it, like a dichotomy, because it's easier to speak that way. But keep in mind, this debate is not just about very young people and old people who are like pensioners. This debate is about every age cohort. So, people who are in the middle, who are 40 years old or 50 years old, are still going to have it harder now because of this policy. They're going to be less disprivileged than the very old individuals, but they're still going to be disprivileged. So just keep in mind that all of the age cohorts come into this debate, and that the more nuanced you go in terms of branching out your argument into different, very specific age groups, the more persuasive and the more nuanced your arguments can become, instead of just having it as, a clear dichotomy of very young versus very old. And that's largely the motion debrief.